Somewhere in your house, probably in a kitchen drawer, or pinned to the refrigerator, or folded into a file you keep meaning to organize, there is a lab result. It has 4 numbers on it: total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides. And at some point, a doctor looked at one of those numbers, maybe circled it, maybe highlighted it in red on a printout, and said something like, "You need to get this down." Maybe that conversation ended with a prescription. Maybe it ended with a pamphlet about eggs. Maybe it ended with you standing in a grocery aisle, reading the back of a mayonnaise jar, wondering how a food you had eaten your entire life had become dangerous. This is not a video about whether cholesterol matters. It does. This is a video about whether the story you were told, the one that shaped how you ate, what your doctor prescribed, and what the back of every food package warned you about for 40 years, was complete. It was not. And the revisions to that story have been so quiet, so incremental, so buried in guideline committee language that most of the people living inside the consequences of the original version never heard that it changed. Before we go any further, if you are currently taking a statin or any cardiovascular medication prescribed by your physician, nothing in this video is a reason to change or stop that medication. That is a conversation between you and your doctor, period. What this video can do is give you better questions to bring to that conversation. Now, let us start with a graph. In the 1950s, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota named Ansel Keys set out to prove a hypothesis that would reshape the dietary guidelines of the Western world. The hypothesis was clean, intuitive, and wrong in a specific way that matters. Saturated fat in your diet raises cholesterol in your blood. Cholesterol in your blood causes heart disease. Therefore, eat less fat. Keys launched what became the 7-country study, formally initiated in 1958, tracking roughly 12,570 men across Finland, Greece, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, the United States, and Yugoslavia. The study found correlations between saturated fat intake, serum cholesterol levels, and heart disease mortality. For its era, the study was genuinely ambitious, international, prospective, large. It was also, in a specific and well-documented way, incomplete. Here is the part most people never hear. The Food and Agriculture Organization datasets Keys was drawing from contained data on 22 countries, not 7. He published 7. A year before Keys completed his study, 2 researchers, Jacob Yerushalmi and Herman Hillebo, published a reanalysis in the New York State Journal of Medicine in 1957, pointing out that when you plotted all 22 countries, the tidy line between fat intake and heart disease mortality fell apart. Countries like France showed high fat consumption and relatively low heart disease. Others contradicted the pattern in different directions. The 15 excluded countries had data that complicated the conclusion. This was not a fringe critique published decades later by internet skeptics. It appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, authored by credentialed epidemiologists, before the policy was built. Science knew. The policy went forward anyway. That distinction matters. 22 countries, 7 selected, 15 excluded. The critique published before the conclusion was cemented. And from that foundation, 4 decades of dietary guidelines were constructed. If you are feeling a specific kind of frustration right now, the kind that comes from realizing the advice you followed may not have been as solid as it sounded, that frustration is reasonable. Sit with it for a moment, but do not let it carry you to the conclusion that cholesterol is a myth, or that heart disease prevention is a hoax, or that every piece of cardiovascular advice you have ever received was wrong. Because the revisions to this story are specific, and specificity is the thing that protects you from trading one oversimplification for another. Let us talk about eggs. For decades, the U.S. dietary guidelines included an explicit upper limit on dietary cholesterol, 300 milligrams per day. That is roughly 1.5 eggs. The logic followed directly from Keyes and his successors. If cholesterol in the blood is dangerous, and cholesterol is in certain foods, then limit those foods. Eggs became a symbol of cardiovascular risk. Omelets became a guilty pleasure. Egg white omelets became a virtue signal. In 2015, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the federal body that reviews the evidence and recommends the guidelines, removed the dietary cholesterol limit entirely. Their language was direct. Cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. After 50 years, the evidence behind this revision had been accumulating for a long time. Multiple meta-analyses, including work published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, established that approximately 2/3 of the population are what researchers call cholesterol non-responders. You can eat dietary cholesterol, eggs, shellfish, liver, and your serum LDL does not meaningfully change. Your body compensates. It produces less endogenous cholesterol when you eat more of it. The remaining third are hyper-responders, whose serum LDL does rise with dietary cholesterol intake. But even in that group, both LDL and HDL typically rise together, leaving the ratio, a more meaningful cardiovascular marker than either number alone, approximately unchanged. A meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies, published in the BMJ in 2013, found no significant association between eating up to 1 egg per day and coronary heart disease or stroke risk in the general population. The one population-specific caveat: in people with diabetes, the relationship may differ. That is an important nuance, not a disqualifier. The federal government quietly revised a 50-year-old dietary restriction. And most Americans never heard about it. Now, here is where the story gets misused, and where you need to be careful. The removal of the dietary cholesterol limit was not a general clearance of high-fat diets. It was not a green light for unlimited saturated fat. The 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans retained the recommendation to limit saturated fat. The American Heart Association's 2017 presidential advisory reaffirmed that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats reduces cardiovascular disease risk. Dietary cholesterol and saturated fat are different substances with different evidence bases, and conflating them, which happens constantly in popular media and on social platforms, is a consequential error. The diet heart story is not fat was innocent all along. It is something more specific and more useful. The original model was cruder than it needed to be, and the refinements matter. Pattern beats nutrient every time. The single strongest finding in nutrition science over the past 2 decades is that dietary patterns, the overall shape of how you eat across weeks and months, predict health outcomes better than any individual nutrient, any single food, any isolated number on a lab panel. The Mediterranean pattern validated in the PREDIME trial, published in 2013 and reanalyzed in 2018. The DASH dietary pattern developed for blood pressure management. Plant-forward, whole food patterns across multiple cultural traditions. These have consistent evidence behind them, not because of any one ingredient they include or exclude, but because of the cumulative effect of the overall pattern. When the low-fat era removed fat from the American diet, what replaced it was not vegetables and olive oil. It was refined carbohydrates, added sugars, fat-free cookies, margarine loaded with trans fats. The pattern got worse while one nutrient got optimized. That is what nutrient reductionism does. It chases a single number while the overall picture degrades. If you have been told at different times in your life that fat was the problem, then carbs were the problem, then sugar, then seed oils, then protein, your skepticism is earned. The pendulum swings. The evidence updates slowly. What has held up across every swing is the pattern-level finding. Eat mostly whole foods, mostly plants, with adequate protein and healthy fats, in a pattern that you can actually sustain and that respects the food traditions you come from. Food is culture before it is chemistry. Now let us look at the lab result itself, because even after you understand the dietary cholesterol revision and the saturated fat nuance, there is another layer to this story, and it is about what your blood test is actually measuring. The standard lipid panel, the one most of us get at an annual physical, reports 4 numbers: total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. In most labs, the LDL number is not even directly measured. It is calculated using something called the Friedewald equation, a formula with known limitations, particularly when triglycerides are high. Total cholesterol as a standalone number is a weak predictor of individual cardiovascular risk. Data from the Framingham Heart Study, one of the longest-running cardiovascular studies in history, showed that approximately 35% of new coronary events occurred in people with total cholesterol below 200. The number that was supposed to mean you were safe. More than a third of heart attacks happened on the safe side of the line. This does not mean cholesterol is irrelevant. It means the measurement is blunter than most of us realize. Research from the Framingham study and the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, known as MESA, has consistently shown that LDL particle number, how many LDL particles are circulating, not just how much cholesterol they carry, is a better predictor of cardiovascular events. 2 people can have the exact same LDL cholesterol number on a standard panel and have very different cardiovascular risk because their LDL particles differ in size and density. Work dating back to the late 1980s, including foundational research published in JAMA in 1988, identified that small, dense LDL particles are more likely to penetrate the arterial wall, more easily oxidized, and more atherogenic than large, buoyant LDL particles. If your LDL particles are predominantly small and dense, what researchers call pattern B, your cardiovascular risk is higher than if they are predominantly large and buoyant, pattern A, even at the same calculated LDL number. Now, before this becomes another oversimplification replacing the last one, here is the calibration. The American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association's 2018 guideline on blood cholesterol management acknowledges apolipoprotein B and LDL particle number as potentially useful risk-enhancing factors, but it does not mandate them as primary screening tools. The standard lipid panel remains the clinical standard of care. Advanced lipid testing is positioned as supplementary, useful in specific cases, not a replacement. The science is real. The guideline adoption is cautious. Both of these things can be true. Here is something practical that does not require advanced testing. Your triglyceride to HDL ratio, which you can calculate from a standard lipid panel, is a reasonable proxy for LDL particle size. Multiple analyses from Framingham and MESA data have shown that a high triglyceride, low HDL pattern, often seen with insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, typically correlates with small, dense LDL predominance. You already have this information on the lab result in your drawer. You may just not have been told to look at it this way. 2 people can have the same total cholesterol of 210. One has high HDL, low triglycerides, and a favorable particle pattern. The other has low HDL, high triglycerides, and a pattern associated with higher risk. The single number told them the same story. The ratio told them different ones. Let us talk about statins. And let us be precise, because precision here is not academic. It is the difference between informed medical decisions and uninformed ones. The cholesterol treatment, trialists' collaboration, the largest and most comprehensive synthesis of statin trial data ever conducted, analyzed individual data from 174,000 participants across 27 randomized trials and published their findings in The Lancet in 2015. Statins reduce major vascular events by approximately 21 to 22% per unit reduction in LDL cholesterol. That is a relative risk reduction. In secondary prevention, meaning people who have already had a heart attack, a stroke, or have established cardiovascular disease, the evidence for statins is very strong. The absolute risk reduction is clinically meaningful because the baseline risk is high. If you are in this group, the benefit is clear, and this video is not suggesting otherwise, not even slightly. The nuance lives in primary prevention, people who have not yet had a cardiovascular event. The Cochrane Review on statins in primary prevention found real benefits. All-cause mortality was reduced. Major cardiovascular events were reduced. But the absolute numbers tell a different story than the relative ones. For a person at low to moderate cardiovascular risk, the absolute risk reduction for a major cardiovascular event over 5 years of statin therapy is approximately 1 to 2 percentage points. That translates to a number needed to treat of roughly 50 to 100, meaning 50 to 100 people take a statin every day for 5 years, so that one person avoids a major cardiovascular event. The other 49 to 99 took the medication without that specific benefit. A 25% relative risk reduction and a 1 to 2% absolute risk reduction are mathematically describing the same data. One is how statin benefits are usually communicated to patients. The other is the one that helps you make an informed decision. This is not an anti-statin argument. This is a risk communication argument. Researchers at the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy, including Lisa Schwartz and Stephen Woloshin, who published extensively in the BMJ and JAMA on exactly this problem, have documented that patients are routinely presented with relative risk reductions and almost never hear the absolute numbers. This is not a conspiracy. It is a systemic failure in how clinical evidence is communicated, and it affects informed consent. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force's 2022 recommendation on statin use in primary prevention reflects this nuance directly. Grade B recommendation, meaning they recommend it only for adults aged 40 to 75 with at least one cardiovascular risk factor and a calculated 10-year event risk of 10% or higher. Below that threshold, grade C, meaning it is an individual decision depending on circumstances and patient values. For very low-risk individuals, the evidence is sparse enough that the USPSTF offers no recommendation at all. The question is not whether statins work. They do in specific populations by specific magnitudes. The question is whether you have been given the specific magnitude that applies to your specific situation. And then there is the side effect picture, which has its own complexity. The Samson trial, published in the BMJ in 2020, found something remarkable. When patients who believed they had statin-induced muscle pain were randomized to take statins, placebo, or nothing, without knowing which they were receiving, approximately 90% of the muscle symptom burden they attributed to statins also occurred on placebo. The nocebo effect, expecting side effects and then experiencing them, contributed meaningfully to the reported side effect profile. This does not mean statin myopathy is imaginary. It is real, documented, and dose-dependent. But the gap between perceived side effects and pharmacologically caused side effects is larger than most people assume. If you are sitting with all of this and feeling like the ground has shifted under a story you thought was settled, that is the appropriate response. The ground did shift. It shifted inside the institutions themselves. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee revised the dietary cholesterol position in 2015. The ACC and AHA acknowledged advanced lipid markers as risk-enhancing factors in 2018. The USPSTF set risk thresholds for statin use in primary prevention, rather than broad population recommendations. The same scientific bodies that built the original framework have been quietly renovating it. The renovation just has not reached most kitchen tables. Here is what the renovation does not say: that cholesterol is a myth, that LDL does not matter, that heart disease is not real, that you should throw away your medication, that saturated fat is harmless, that you can eat anything without consequence. If someone is telling you that version, they have taken a legitimate scientific revision and inflated it into ideology. What the revision actually says is more useful and less dramatic. Dietary cholesterol, for most people, is not the risk factor it was framed as for 50 years. Total cholesterol alone is a crude instrument. The particle carrying the cholesterol matters as much as the amount. The ratio between your triglycerides and your HDL, sitting on that lab result you already have, may tell you more than the number your doctor circled. And the benefit of any medication is best understood in absolute terms, not relative ones, applied to your specific risk profile, not a population average. If you are managing cardiovascular risk, or if you are over 40 and wondering whether you should be, a registered dietitian is the evidence-trained professional for the dietary piece of that puzzle, not a nutritionist, which is an unregulated title in many states. A registered dietitian, RD or RDN, with the credential and the clinical training to work with your specific numbers, your specific history, your specific foods. And your physician or cardiologist is the partner for the medication conversation, armed, ideally, with absolute risk numbers, not just relative ones. The diet book is not the same thing as the evidence. Think about the last time you sat in a doctor's office and heard a cholesterol number read aloud. Think about the feeling attached to it. The relief if it was low, the anxiety if it was high, the sense that a single number had rendered a verdict on your body. That feeling was engineered by a story that started with 7 carefully selected countries, and a hypothesis that turned out to be incomplete. You deserve better numbers. You deserve better questions. And you deserve a conversation with your physician where you hear the absolute version of the evidence, not the marketing version, and where you decide together what makes sense for your life. The next time you look at that lab result, the one in the drawer, the one pinned to the fridge, the one folded into the file, look at all 4 numbers. Look at the ratio and bring a question your doctor may not expect. What is my absolute risk reduction if I take this medication for 5 years? Not the relative number, the real one. That is not distrust of medicine. That is medicine working the way it is supposed to. If you found this useful, leave a comment with the nutrition or health claim you have heard most often that you suspect does not hold up under scrutiny. Subscribe for evidence without supplement pitches, without diet prescriptions, without moralizing. The calibrated version.